Well, hello, everybody. This is Sarah Colata with Architecture Talk Tank, and today I have Kevin Sherrod with me. Kevin and we connected on LinkedIn, and he is working for Gensler, living in LA. And we're going to talk a little bit about his career and the different projects that he's involved with. So, thank you so much, Kevin, for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. It's
It's a
wonderful.
pleasure, really.
No, the pleasure is definitely mine.
So right before we sort of appeared live to a broader audience, we talked a little bit about your origins and how you come from from Philadelphia and moved to California. So tell me a little bit more about this and your journey as an architect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, in 1999, I'd say there was a high school and it had just opened up, and it was a kind of one of those kind of installations from the AIA, the Philadelphia chapter, where they were really trying to strengthen the pipeline to get kind of minorities into the field of architecture as a way to kind of bolster the numbers and diversity, right? Because we've seen that they've been dismal at times, or even still dismal. Um, and so they created a high school, and the sole intent of the high school was really to really get people access and education, right, and help them to kind of identify the lens in which creative expression can be used going forward. So the school was primarily centered around the curriculum of architecture. So in high school we had studios, right, and it's kind of a weird kind of thing to think about studio in high school, but the studio was not holistically architecture. There was fashion design, and they were really trying to be as creative as they possibly could with the core lessons centered around architecture. And so I actually was the first 4-year graduating class of that high school, which is the first in the United States. In my sense is that there's probably few globally. And so that was my first introduction to architecture in high school. And needless to say, I hated everything about it because I was in high school. And high school is one of those things where it feels like your entire life is consumed by the kind of social dynamics that happen while you're in school. And so 2 hours of studio, 3 hours of studio felt like an eternity at all times. And it was a daily thing. So needless to say, I rebelled 3,000% to architecture, and I started to use my creative expression as a dancer. And I had been doing
Oh,
so
wow.
after school and extracurricular activities. And I was dancing for a dance company in South Philadelphia at the time, and it kind of led me to attending the University of the Arts for my first kind of go round at university as a dancer, and that was my major. So it's been one of those things where architecture in general has really just taught me the the real identity of myself, which is creative expression, regardless to if it's physical, intellectual, or it's around the built environment.
Mm.
But suffice it to say, I hated everything about it when I was in Philadelphia. I hated architecture for the sake of architecture.
So interesting. Actually, I somehow to me like both dance and architecture combines really well. In London, I went also to an art school studying architecture. So it wasn't very architectural. We had all this different intersection of other arts, and it opened my mind a lot as to how architecture kind of and dance blend in. And I remember back in the day, there was this beautiful performance of Anthony Gomley in London. And it was dancers dancing on sort of almost like this, what do you call it? These walking sticks, when you break your
Yeah.
leg.
Yes.
It was absolutely marvelous. These bodies on this very long sort of sticks, stilettos. I don't know how to call it, but
Yeah.
because they were climbing them, and it was just beautiful. And then also their expression in space and how they arranged the whole stage. And we used to actually be kind of encouraged by our teachers to take a lot of inspiration from theater and the movement as well within space. So I think it's a really beautiful way that these two things combine. and I'm really fond of dance. Actually, I like to dance myself, more so on the ballet side of things. So training that in my free time as much as I can, and I really love that also from this the aspect of how you can express yourself in a space. But it sounds like you had quite a committed path into dance. So what got you into fully committing to architecture too at some stage?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think for me, it's always been about kind of the idea of creative expression and how I use, my faculties to be in service to that. Became the kind of the thing that kind of resonated with me most. And so, as you know, as a dancer and you're young, you feel invincible. But there becomes this day, like you mentioned when you're at the ballet bar, where you recognize, you're in constant struggle with yourself to better yourself. And it occurred to me all at once, is this something that I can keep up for 10, 15, 20, 30 years? And the answer, if I was being honest with myself, is it isn't. It's not something that I can keep up. I mean, I was in, probably the greatest shape of my life. And that was because before dance, it was football. And it was one of those things that dance actually started because I was trying to do rehabilitation for a football injury. So it was one of those things that, it's just a systematic thing of me being able to kind of express myself and deal in kind of a space of wellness, that it kind of promoted itself as dance. And so I recognized as much. And I can never say that I was unhappy dancing, because it's where I've been at my best. And I think, if we check the tape, we'll see that that's probably where I was at my best, in terms of the grand scheme of my life. But it really became to me that I wanted to be in service to people in different ways. And so, instantly I said that, hey, I had to give up my scholarship, because if I'm not dancing, that was what um, I was being kind of ushered through school doing. And if I didn't want to do that, I would have to find a way to pay for it on my own. And coming from an architecture and design charter high school, earlier in my high school, it left me in a weird space. Not because I didn't have the kind of tools to be successful, but I didn't have it on paper, right? So I had the creative tools, in my person, but it wasn't something that I was able to translate to paper. I wasn't able to tell the story of who I was on paper. I was only able to express it through my personal faculties, right? And so I wanted to go to a community college to be able to do as much, to kind of grow myself and get to a 5 year and do my graduate work. But financially, I couldn't do it. I'm from the inner city, where we don't have access and opportunity in that way. And so creative expression taught me a lot about myself in that moment, and how I needed to think differently about my educational track or path. And that's how I ended up in Los Angeles, because I couldn't afford it. And so I needed to flip the game and figure out how I could play it differently. This is about creative expression at the end of the day, because it's about how do you creatively get to where you want to be in life, right? And this is a larger landscape, because it's not specific to architecture, right? Like, as you can know, I've talked about football, dance, and architecture in one kind of creative kind of soliloquy. But it led me to Los Angeles. And when I got to Los Angeles, I think I had like $25 in my pocket. And it was literally just kind of, because I had that ballet training and that dance background. And I think it was important to be specific about the type of modern I was studying. It put me in a really interesting place, because the distance between my school and my place of residence was 70 blocks, one direction. And so I used every bit of my energy and ability to walk that 70 blocks to educate myself at the local community college. The reason why I did that is because in Philadelphia, it costs you some $300 a unit, right? And you need 12, 13 units to be successful and get your AA and graduate on time. But in Los Angeles is significantly different when you become a resident. It was at the time in between $20 and $25 a unit, which was way more palatable to someone who got off a plane with $20 in his pocket. So I worked as a personal trainer, and I walked and walked and walked, to educate myself at the local community colleges. And they wrapped their arms around me, so much so that they allowed me to really kind of be available to the architectural experience in that way. I use programs and different kind of services for people who just didn't have a way to make ends meet, and that's really how I kind of got through my community college work. And then it transitioned to me going to SCI-Arc, and from SCI-Arc, I think we all know at this point what happens when you go to these avant-garde schools. It's just another lesson in creativity. They ask me like, "Oh, weren't you, you're interested in the bulbous shape, the form, function, blah blah blah?" And I was like, "Actually, I think the most important skill Sire taught me is how to swim better, right? Through life, you develop a bunch of street smarts and all these other things in your education. It helps you with book smarts. But if you can't synchronize those in a way that they have, where they edify each other and it helps you transcend who and what you are, then you become stagnant in many ways. And so for me, it's never been about architecture. It's always been about how can I grow creatively. And SCI-Arc was instrumental in that. But it wasn't easy, right? Even as kind of a two-term president of the student union at SCI-Arc, I still was in danger of not graduating because I didn't have the finances necessary to get through SCI-Arc. So my thesis year, I was actually in jeopardy of not graduating. So my last semester, I was brought into the counselor's office and said, "You can present your thesis, we'll accept it, but you can't graduate." Um, Square one, right? And so, again, it forced me to flip the educational model over and investigate it, for myself. And I was fortunate because all the opportunities that I had, I was focused and I was prepared. And that kind of intersectionality, they call it luck, but I think it obviously is that moment where preparation and opportunity collide. And when they collide, it creates a new environment or a new way for you to kind of understand the moment in a way that you can personally be successful. But you have to have the creative lens to do as much. And so I was fortunate. A little known person named Thom Mayne stepped in and helped me out.
So interesting. It almost sounds like, this is like a journey of designing yourself and designing your own unique life. And I think that all those obstacles, whether it had to do with, the location or maybe even the approaches that were, limiting and not diverse enough or inclusive enough in your past school, and as well as to do with actually being able to afford to pass exams and actually finish the school. All of those obstacles, so to speak, were there to shape and form that journey and that beautiful journey we call life. And it sounds to me like you've been very ambitious through it too. From working on your body through also having ambitious goals to, SCI-Arc is not just any school of architecture. So that's really all great. And it's awesome to see that everything is possible when you have that determination. And as you say, being able to readily kind of observe a situation that life kind of puts in front of us and be like, okay, this is maybe a combination of lack and opportunity, but I'm ready to step through it. I think a lot of people also approach a lot of times this kind of situations with a bit of fear. So what is the number one biggest thing that you've learned through all of this?
I think the number one thing that I've learned is that you just have to be comfortable, uncomfortable in many ways, right? And I think, through creative expression, you deal with life as a certain amount of forces that come into play. And much like architecture or the creative kind of way of dealing with life, it's really about shaping and molding and situating or choreographing these forces, right? And so the same can be true in the built environment as it can be for oneself, right? You really start to deal in a mastery of kind of matter in that way, right? Architecturally, it's inert matter, but in kind of conceptually, you're dealing with the forces of life, right? And those forces are relatively similar. They're political, they're financial, economical, blah blah blah. So you get the list, but they're very parallel. And those who can use their lived experience to make sense of things that are written about, typically are the people who really have a real firm grasp on what it is they need to do to be successful. And I think success looks different for every person. I think we shouldn't measure success based on what we see other people doing on Instagram or these other things, because you'll just be in a hyper depressed state. because nobody can keep up with the taxonomy of accomplishments of everyone but we still suffer from that at times, right? But I think it's really fascinating, and to be fair, even through grad school, it was the same kind of journey and obstacles, right? Like you know, I was kind of bought on by Thom Mayne to help him with the 100 Buildings book, which I'm forever grateful for. And I worked through a fellowship with him to A, get out of SCI-Arc, but B, go through grad school. And I can just working kind of with him and understanding the lens of architecture through his gaze was really interesting to me, because while we're totally different and I'm not interested or ever will be in that Starkitect level, it's really interesting to see how much overlap on how you understand the world you exist in, and yourself, right? Like understanding self. But to back to my point, because there's obviously a digression, is that I almost didn't graduate UCLA either with my graduate degree. I got in late because of the kind of tension at SCI-Arc, that really set me back, and I almost ran the risk of A, not being able to accept my fellowship, but B, not graduating. And so that's when I got into teaching, because they said, okay, clearly you don't need the last bit of coursework. Will allow you to teach as a way to remedy that. And so that's how I got into teaching. And so it was another door that was shutting, that found itself being an opportunity for me to enter the classroom in a way that I could never dream possible, right? Especially at a kind of university at UCLA, right? So, and to kind of wrap it all up, I've went through, let's say it's been 10 years of like architectural study, not including high school, which is an extra 4, so call it 14. And I've never been taught by someone with the same skin tone from my culture or anything like that. It was non-existent. And I mean, who goes a decade without being in a space with someone who looks like them? I will say, in my entire journey, I may have been in a classroom with maybe 3 or 4 other people who identify as Black or African American. It's a long time to go and study without seeing someone that looks like you. And so it's become my personal why to make sure that um, I'm in the classroom and available and accessible to people, because I think it's important, right? There's been an erasure, right, so to speak, of the Black and brown experience in architecture, and I'm not trying to undo it by myself, but I'm just trying to use my life as a kind of platform of either what to do or what not to do. I don't want to be in the middle where people are kind of like, maybe. I want to be, don't do that or do that, right? Like, I want to be either or. So.
Exactly. And I think it's important for also the world that we're creating for the future, for our future generations, to show more inclusivity and basically diversity everywhere, also in the work environment. Gensler is very inclusive. I know that they talk a lot about this. Are you finding yourself there? Tell me a little bit about the experience of working for them.
Sure. I mean, I think many of the kind of viewers are keenly aware of Gensler, the kind of one firm mentality, power of design, the 6,000 person firm that stretches 50 offices and many different regions. But I'd like to kind of take it apart slightly, because I think we forget, because we're the largest architecture firm, they forget that the individual, the like-minded individual, or the individual that has similar whys and interests, create a larger body, so part to whole in that way. And so people understand us as this kind of force in commercial architecture, so on and so forth, but they're like-minded individuals even in these kind of smaller studios that we work. And to kind of give you a kind of anecdotal story about that is, I work on a team of 5 or 6 individuals whose whole kind of mission is really about thinking about the problems of the day. And for us in Los Angeles, it's people experiencing homelessness,
Yeah.
and also communities that deal in inequity. And so my time at Gensler has quite literally been about dealing in kind of permanent supportive housing, teen centers. As you can see on my shirt, art gallery. We just did the first kind of Black-owned art gallery by Gensler in South Los Angeles. So it's been one of those kind of labors of love because it allows me to use my creativity in ways that I never really imagined possible. And so, we're working on not just that, but we're working on a new kind of project led by Wayne Thomas, a Debbie Allen Dance Academy. So you can see how my life is becoming this full circle thing, right? Like I started dancing, and now I get to work on a
Yeah.
performing arts center. It's cyclical in nature. You just have to be available.
Yeah, and also in a beautiful way, how it also comes with giving back to the community, and the projects that you're involved with in LA right now sound amazing. I'm really into humanitarian architecture, so that kind of element of working with communities that face other like I would call it real life problems, because a lot of times when architecture comes to a private project, I mean, of course we're problem solving, but these problems are kind of first world problems, right?
Absolutely.
If you compare that to dealing with humanitarian sector, and it's very rewarding just to see a smile on the face or a life changed by the implementation of these projects, and knowing that you had a role at it as well. It's rewarding, so that's really beautiful, and I think that it's just a great journey to see you also work at Gensler now. Tell me a little bit about the urban projects that you've been doing. I've seen your portfolio, and they look very environmental, very sustainable. So they definitely have a lot of elements of this respect to nature and sustainability there as well. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I think so. So a lot of my projects have been just that, right? It's really it's like rethinking, like, and it's really critical work, and not critical as in necessary, critical as in I'm commenting on things. So when you see, for instance, I've created one, and it looks like this giant park, but under it is this, massive infrastructure, and it's because there's a place in the world that said, oh, we need more parks, but the city's programming is a park, right? And they have like a kind of illustrative plan for how they do that. They've had a tremendous kind of tree planting kind of strategy, so on and so forth. But it refused to deal with the kind of like the reality of infrastructure that's necessary to make the city self kind of sufficient or reliant in that way. And so when they said, oh, we need another park, it was kind of me being slightly on the nose about it. It was like, here's a park, right? But I'm hiding everything under it, right? And so in many ways, I'm talking about kind of the infrastructure becoming the stage, right? The historically back of house mechanisms that we need to sustain ourselves in cities and regions. I'm giving it the kind of the red carpet. I'm presenting it as the front of house in many ways, because as the kind of street edge, I want people to see 100% what's actually happening. And they're all sustainable technologies that kind of really help the city meet its larger goals, in terms of climate, resilience, and so on and so forth. But it's me kind of poking fun at the fact that there was a consensus, like, oh, we need another park, and it's kind of like, you actually are shipping in enough water to bankroll cities around you. We need to be aware of the kind of impact the carbon emissions, just the truck services to and from your city. Like, we can house these things here, we can do it in a really smart way, but we need another park is not the answer, for your problem. So I was kind of being on the nose about some of the things. Some of the things were really just about, there's a project that we created, with Thom Mayne, and it was the South Sea Pearl project, that there was a larger competition, and I created an X. And because I was really kind of commenting on the absurdity of needing an island in the middle of the ocean with all this undeveloped land just miles to the east of the project. And so it was just kind of like an X marks the spot. It was me being funny, and so on and so forth. And people really took a liking to it, because I really thought about it architecturally. I thought about, how do you deal with sustainability and efficiency at a kind of high level in terms of the discourse of architecture. But I like to be playful. I'm serious most of the times, but when I'm not, I'm really, really playful. So I think that had to show through. I was trying to show through in my work. I just think it's interesting to keep it really intentional, but at the end of the day, you got to laugh at yourself. Like you can't take yourself too serious, because when people take the things that you're really serious away from you, what do you really got?
Absolutely. And I think it's really important as well to express that notion of concept behind architecture. Like practical approaches to architecture are important, but it's when we have that freedom to play around with at the intersection of almost the unimaginary, or making a joke at something. It's when we can show the absurdity of situations, and architecture can really question those approaches very well, to urban planning, to the way that we actually use resources, or how we design for people, and also the absurdity of where we want to place projects when, as you say, there's a lot of land available for it. But I like the way you approach it, and the project looks amazing. Really good.
Thank
Really
you.
good.
No, and look, I can be as serious as the next person, right? Like in the classroom, I joke, but I'm very serious about the education, because I recognize that I'm in service, right? Like I don't take education as something that's a responsibility for me to do. I think of it as a service, as a craft, as a skill, as a muscle that you have to consistently work to be good at. But I also think it only has as much value as you put in. I think teaching should be it should be an outpouring of yourself. It shouldn't be something that, oh, I'm gaining this and I can archive it. Like I'm less interested in that, and I'm more interested in pouring myself out. Because here's the reality: I went through architecture school 14 years and have never seen anyone like me. The reality is, because I teach at a university that half the schools are international, they may never see another person that looks like me. So it's important that I represent the fullness of what I can be in their lives in the classroom. And so the class is structured around GIS, and so it really is just a kind of different way of looking at architecture. So we kind of go through these exercises where we in a kind of architectural framework, because it's a master's course. We still use the architectural lens, but we use GIS as a way to start to introduce kind of multidiscipline ways of thinking about the world, and start to introduce forces, and start to look at what that means. And so the data sets, when you kind of like graphically represent them, they start to give place, and they start to make it more of a reality. And it's easier for people to consume, not just the students in the class, but cities, municipalities, constituent groups, communities. We want to make the data accessible. And so this is an exercise in how do you make informed decisions smartly, in a kind of just way, right? By using the tools that you're given. And so it's kind of an introduction to GIS in many ways, but it's really using the data that exists. Like we're not creating data sets from scratch. It would take a much longer kind of like repetition and coursework to be able to do as much, but the data exists. Use it, make better, smarter, and kind of be in service to the data itself and the communities that the data represents. So far and so often, this data is extractive in nature. We need a way to be cyclical. We need it to be intergenerational. We need to allow the community to be stewards of said information. And how do we do that? It's representing this information and really educating the community. Because the co-creative model is the model that it's a necessity on the path forward, especially if we talk about design, equity, justice, so on and so forth. I think it's monumentally important, and on the path forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also to keep talking and opening these conversations, in the process, so that people that don't see this as an obvious can educate themselves as well, because it's important to promote basically more inclusive approaches to design, as well as to the whole experience of actually learning and even becoming an architect. That's why more and more topics are covered right now in architecture on this, to just raise awareness, I think. And it's great that you're doing it, and you committed your work as well to helping the future generations to realize that. And that's great. So it sounds to me like you're a great designer of your own life and your own path that you're on. So what's next for you?
I think what's next is really kind of doubling down on the idea of really being in service to the community. As of late, I've been doing research into kind of a co-creative model where there are kind of mechanisms of outreach that create kind of a cyclical conversation between myself and the community and Gensler and the community that's not predicated on a project. I think one of the biggest problems that we have in architecture is we only come to the community when there's a project, or we only exist and start trying to think about the issues of the day if there's a project to speak of. But I'm interested in being there and starting to kind of build this nuanced conversation, because they're going to be uncomfortable, they're going to be, like, but that's okay. It's, you want to be in the space where you empty yourself out so you can be filled. You don't want to walk into the space, oh, I know it. You don't. Like, and the reality is, if you walk into a Black or brown community and you think that you have the ability to make them more resilient than they already have been through the past 400 or 500 years, incorrect. Like, we're talking about people who have been kidnapped, stolen, put on boats, died. People have murdered them, been murdered. They've been hung, lynched. We can go through the taxonomy of history of, the mistreatment of the Black and brown body in the United States, and globally. But the reality is, you're not going to find a stronger, more resilient people group, right? That's not actually possible in this moment. And especially, I think many people have seen kind of the news and the kind of mistreatment and the kind of murder of the Black and brown bodies. I mean, just yesterday we lost Dante Wright, and and police brutality. So we're constantly fighting to be resilient, to be present, to be available, to be accessible, to educate ourselves, and to move forward. And look, we love our country, we love our people, we love our kind of global, citizenship that we share with everyone in the world. The only thing we're really asking for is that our country love us back, right? It's really difficult to be in love with someone who doesn't love with, or aren't in love with you, but that's what we're continually asked to do. And we're continuing to ask to put our hard hat on and show up to work and do our 9 to 5s in service to others while we're hurting and we're experiencing this trauma. And so architecturally, I'm really interested in co-creation and being in service, because that availability means everything to me. It means everything to them to know that, look, I don't just sit in, Gensler, and I've been heard it called the ivory tower from people in the community. And it's like, well, fine, then I'll put my desk in your office. Let's figure this out together. I'm not interested in doing this for you. I tell people to think of me as a kind of graphic stenographer. I want to make physical the communal voice. I'm not interested in my own voice being told. I had that time in architecture, my thesis, the books that I've helped create, so on and so forth. I've had my time. This is your time. Help me help you. Think of me as a tool in the toolbox, right? Like, think of me as, the hammer, or think of me as the wrench. Don't think of me as the hammer, wrench, element. Don't think of me of all those things. Think of me as one unique tool in your toolbox that you can use to create. And that's what this gallery is about. It's a gallery owned by a Compton native, and I think some in this country, roughly 1.2% of art is Black in the fine art space. And so we created this gallery to create education access, vocational programming, so on and so forth. That's really starting to kind of catch fire in this region. And it's because, it was about the chronology of memory and advocacy and art that's always kind of the lens of storytelling through our kind of counterparts and our peers, to really help educate the community on themselves and what our path forward is and where we are, in terms of the climate of the day. So creating spaces that are treasures, like that are memorialized and kind of store our consciousness, are essential. And so teen centers are one of those things, performing arts centers are one of those things, art galleries are one of those things. It's really just about creating a taxonomy of cultural relics that tell our stories and inspire us to go beyond, where we are currently.
Yeah, and I really admire the resilience there, because I think that, all the situation calls sometimes for just feeling angry, for pure anger to come out of a human being, And at that stage, all you want to do is rage and not be involved and not be proactive. And I completely understand that. I feel angry, and yet I'm not targeted or experiencing it. So I think that like I really always admire this the strength really in going forward and fighting for this in the fight that is proactive, that is community oriented, that takes the stand in all the right things, and also shines through experience and the way it's walked, so that it can actually be a testimony, to a better character that is not ego driven, that is not a character that basically nourishes differences, but rather similarities amongst people. And I love the fact that you express yourself in all these projects and also collaborate on the grassroots level with communities, not only by providing housing for disadvantaged communities in LA, but also through all these different art projects. And it's indeed really beautiful how life comes around in respect of expression and art scene and the dance scene as well. And I'm really curious to see what's next for you as well, and just follow your career, because it's really beautiful and inspiring. And thank you so much for coming on this podcast to share that story with me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do as much. And I think one thing that, if I had a closing kind of thought, it would be, my story is not unique. This story happens to everyone who looks like me to some degree. And I think, it's important to recognize the shoulders in which I stand on, because while I may have had it hard, my sense is that their journey was harder than mine, because the world wasn't as accepting of, different races and creeds and religions. And so, and I think, I just have to be a strong set of shoulders, so, the next generation can stand on mine. And it'll be intergenerational. And once we can establish that intergenerational link, we can grow pipelines and so on and so forth, and numbers will be much more representative of the creativity that exists in the world. You can't paint with all the colors if you don't have a brush to paint with, right?
True. Absolutely. Thank you so much, really, for joining and sharing all this beautiful story with us.
Happy to. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you guys also for tuning in. We'll see you soon.